All right. So the War of Colonial Independence, 1775 to 1783. There's a long version of this which goes into all the details of the military campaigns and battles, or there's the short version. I think I will give you the short version. There's plenty of material out there on the American Revolution from a military standpoint, but please, and feel free to find it. It's out there. There's classes on the American Revolution here at U of M Dearborn, so I think you would probably be better served, by looking more deeply into something like that. So how does it start? We have this kind of concept of what's going on, and we've heard these things, throughout our lives when we talk about the American Revolution. I'll just give you a little bit of things here. First of all, it's a small conflict by the standards of the times. No more than 35,000 American colonists served under arms at any one time, and this actually peaked in 1776. No more than 20,000 North American or colonial troops ever fought in one place at one time, and there was really no more than 100,000 who ever served totally during the whole 8-year conflict. The the revolutionaries were organized into a colonial militia, but they were also then organized into a continental army of about 17,000 men. British regular army, the redcoats that we know and talk about so much, about 8,500 were stationed in the colonies in 1775. 4,000, at least almost half of them then, were stationed in Boston at 1775. They were commanded by a guy named General Thomas Gage. And interestingly enough, we don't think or talk much about this, but, in the American colonies, there were 20,000 colonial citizens who remained loyal to the British Crown, and there was some really nasty kind of guerrilla warfare in the backcountry that goes on between the revolutionaries and the loyalists, or also known as Tories here in the United States. So the war really kind of comes down in 3 phases. The New England phase, which is April 1775 to kind of spring 1776, and you don't have to write these down, I'm just giving you some background. The Mid-Atlantic phase, so summer 1776 to 1778, and then finally a Southern phase, 1778 to October 1781. New England phase begins then at Lexington and Concord on 1819 April 1775. Essentially, some of these American patriots, what's his name, that horrible beer I hate, Sam Adams, some of the others in Boston, had kind of agitated against the British government enough that warrants for arrest were issued for them, and the British authorities were going to arrest them. They were basically given advance warning. We remember the ride of Paul Revere, the British are coming, and all this. But anyway, they get advance warning and they skedaddle out of Boston. They head west towards Lexington and Concord. The British then send out a force to go hunt them down, and they had also heard that at Lexington and Concord that the colonials had been hoarding weapons, so they were going to hunt these guys down, and they were also going to kind of capture these weapons and try to put an end to this thing. It doesn't work out that way, essentially. Lexington, they show up, they're met by colonial militia, there's kind of a standoff, nobody knows who fired first, but that is the beginning of the American Revolution, or the War for Colonial Independence, however we want to call it. From there, they marched on to Concord. They find neither the people they want to arrest or the cache of weapons, so they begin to march back to Boston. I think it's like a 20-mile march. And on the way back, they are harassed by these continental militia members who aren't fighting the way they're supposed to fight, right? So the British Army in warfare at the time was really this concept of them lining up in neat rows about 100 yards from each other on a battlefield and marching towards each other and fighting it out. Well, the American colonists, what they do is, as the British are marching back towards Boston, they are essentially sniping at them behind trees, behind stone fences, stone walls, etc., etc. And so this has really becomes like this 20-mile gauntlet of death for these British troops who have to get back to Boston. Anyway, a lot of them are killed. They get back to Boston, and things kind of go from there. In May 1775, so just a month later, there's a Continental Congress of representatives from the colonies who meet in Philadelphia. They name a guy named George Washington as the general commander-in-chief of this new Continental Army. Washington was a British citizen, right? He had been an officer in the French and Indian Wars between 1756 and 63. He was really the most experienced man for the job, I guess, at that point, so they picked him. He was also a Virginian, which was the most populous and the most influential colony of the 13 colonies. He liked to gamble. He apparently cussed a lot. And, from an American standpoint, he also was was controversial. He owned a plantation and he owned slaves. So a lot of the founding fathers did. So Bunker Hill, same day that Washington is commissioned, June 17, 1775, there's the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston. Long story. It's a blistering hot day. The Americans had fortified the high ground overlooking the city and the harbor of Boston at a place called Breed's Hill and on Bunker Hill. It was a blistering hot day. The British commander Gage orders conventional frontal attack against the fortifications on Breed's Hill, and he sends 2,200 British redcoats up the hill to knock this fortification out. This is where we see this idea of, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes kind of thing. And the Americans in their fortifications wait for the British to close within 15 to 20 paces. That's very close. And they open fire. It took the British 3 attempts to take Breed's Hill, and they finally do. It costs them over 1,000 casualties. The American revolutionaries only take 400, and a British general, George Clinton, says basically this was a dear-bought victory, and another such one will ruin us. So they learn a lot of lessons there, the British Army does, at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. December 1775, Britain closes the colonies off to all foreign trade, and George III begins to hire mercenaries from Hesse, which, remember, we talked about before. That was kind of the British way of war with their small professional army that was then bolstered by the hiring of mercenaries. March 1776, the colonials, the colonial militia, and by now I think Washington had showed up, had fortified the Dorchester Heights, which sat above the Boston Harbor, began to place artillery on them, which makes the harbor almost unusable for the British. General Gage is replaced by a guy named General William Howe. Howe, seeing kind of the writing on the wall, orders the British evacuation of British troops from Boston to Halifax, back up to Nova Scotia, to Canada, to where they would await reinforcements. So really, by March of 1776, it looked like British power had really collapsed everywhere in North America. So that's kind of the end of this first phase, this New England phase. I think I probably won't go into too much more detail from there. Gives you an idea of kind of what's going on, but militarily. So if we go back, so we went through this colonial phase, Lexington and Concord. Along the way, we kind of have, some certain, I guess, really important documents, not only for British history, but for American history. So, 1776, Thomas Paine writes something called Common Sense, a pamphlet, and in it he really is rallying the American colonists against the king, and he says the law should be king in America, not the king. So, July, in response, not as a follow-up, I guess, to this, in July of 1776, the American Congress that had been formed passes or writes the Declaration of Independence. This is really Lockean dissolution of the original contract of sovereignty of Parliament, and it now is the idea that Parliament rules as by the consent of the governed. So it's a, Declaration of Independence is really this kind of breaking away, the final straw that breaks the colonies away from Great Britain. So British strategy. So I said before they had kind of Howe had gone back to Halifax. He begins to wait reinforcements. When they finally show up, the main British strategy is to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. So they begin by attacking New York. General Howe lands in Long Island in 1776. Begins massing his troops there, and he's eventually going to cross into Manhattan, and he's going to try, to chase the colonials out of Manhattan, which he does. Meanwhile, another British general, a guy named Johnny Burgoyne, begins to move south from Canada into the Hudson River Valley, and really the idea was, for Burgoyne to come south, Howe to come west. They would meet up and they would cut off. This would be New England. I guess we should probably actually just look at the map. That would be easier here, right? That's why I have these things. So the idea then is for Burgoyne to move south. Where's New York? Right there. Kind of maybe in this direction. Howe would move this way. They meet up. They would cut off New England, kind of this concept of cutting the head off the snake. And Howe should have really tried to keep this linking up, but instead what he does, and I don't have the map here, is once he gets into Manhattan proper, Washington's troops begin to move north up the kind of peninsula of Manhattan, if you want to call it that, and so instead of continuing west, Howe makes the mistake of kind of chasing him, and he continues to chase him into New Jersey and then into Pennsylvania. So this causes a big problem. They're never able to link up. Eventually, Burgoyne is surrounded because he's kind of left hanging in the wind outside of Saratoga by a much smaller colonial force, but it's much more mobile. How far Burgoyne finds himself surrounded at Saratoga and wiped out. Saratoga is interesting for this. It's not really that big of a battle. Burgoyne loses his army, he's defeated, but the main point is it convinced the French to ally with the rebels, with the colonials. So by 1778, Great Britain really faces the threat of a new world war. And by 1780, it's fighting not only the colonial rebels, but it's fighting France, the Spanish, and the Dutch, who are all three looking for payback for, several different times the British kind of defeated them. The problem is now that they have to deal with these other powers, it draws the British Navy off, and it loses its superiority because, remember, we always talk about the superiority of the British Navy, and it forces them to kind of lose their superiority in the American theater. So maybe, 1777, 1778 are really watersheds for that reason. So a new strategy emerges in this. So up to 1777, this is that end of that mid-Atlantic phase, and we begin to see 1778 and on is this southern phase, which will really be the end of the war. New commander, Lord Cornwallis, captures Georgia and South Carolina, and the idea is then he will begin to head north and try to separate the southern colonies from the northern colonies. Again, there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's a different class, more of a military history class. Suffice it to say, Cornwallis ends up chasing the American rebels, the colonials, all around the south. He chases them then up the Yorktown Peninsula into Virginia. And it's there that he ends up being kind of stuck. The French fleet rolls in to the Chesapeake Bay. It cuts him off from any kind of seaward retreat. Washington then comes in, and at a place called Yorktown, Cornwallis is surrounded, and he has to surrender in 1781. The war would kind of go on for 2 more years in different theaters, but by 1783, it's the end of the American Revolution, or the end of the colonial uprising, whatever we want to call it. And that's it. So the Treaty of Versailles, 1783, what does it do? It ends the war, gives America its independence. Who were the biggest winners? Ironically enough, England and America. They're the biggest winners. The French and the Spanish are the biggest losers. And the British, I don't know. I know a lot of Britons who basically say that it was addition by subtraction. I'm not quite sure I agree with that. But Britain, they lose 1/5 of the population of their empire. But they get to keep a lot of the empire. They keep Gibraltar, they keep Canada, they keep Newfoundland. France and Spain had to lose territory in the West Indies. And actually, French participation and support of the American colonists during the American Revolution will have really great consequences for France in just a few more years. To those of you who know anything about the French Revolution, which breaks out in 1789, because it basically bankrupts the French crown. How else did Britain win? By 1790, British exports to the United States are higher than they were at pre-war levels. So really, America and Great Britain are the biggest winners. All that cutting off of land between the Appalachians and Mississippi, all is given to America. So they get a big chunk of land, and they're allowed to expand into that. So all in all, that's kind of the down and dirty American Revolution. Why does Britain lose? I guess that's the big question here. Number one, I think they failed to understand, or to try to understand, that really all the colonists ever really wanted were the rights that they claimed as true-born Englishmen. The colonists, I think, for their part, never really wanted true representation in Parliament. The Scottish, after 1700, had gotten representation, and it really did nothing to help them, so it really wouldn't have done much to help the American colonists either. But I think Parliament really could have avoided all this if they had just given some degree of autonomy to the American colonists. This didn't need to come from the king, it needed to come from Parliament. And I think American history as we learn it in high school and things like that, always paints George III as the tyrant here. But in many ways, the real tyrant was the British Parliament and the House of Commons, the Whigs, the property classes. They were the ones that were insisting on paying these taxes and putting the yoke onto the American colonists. Although, again, yoke on the American colonists may be a bit harsh. I don't think the American colonists themselves probably had it as bad as they have been portrayed. Finally, the British lose because, they never really fully commit to the war in North America. Their strategy is wrong. They don't bring to bear their entire military force that they can. And, honestly, they fight the wrong war there. And which is really, when you think about it, because the United States ends up kind of doing the same thing in Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s. I'm not saying that there's that many parallels, but, you don't bring the full might of your military to bear on the enemy. You refuse to change your tactics and adopt them to fighting against the way the enemy fights, right? So, I said earlier, the British Army and most continental European armies all did this lining up, these set-piece battles on the battlefield. It was all very gentlemanly. One of the reasons that Washington is able to escape New York with his army in 1776 is that it was basically thought he was going to surrender, so they paused long enough for him to kind of get his thoughts together on surrender, and while they're waiting for him to do that, he just skedaddles. So, wrong war, wrong cause, wrong military tactics, complete misunderstanding, not very well executed. So there you go. British Empire Part 1 over. Out. Later.